Thanks for joining today to review the VIPC Advanced process for ID verification. Since the launch of the responsive entry path in December of 2018, all volunteers who are 18 or older are required to provide proof of identification at the time of application. This provides an extra layer of safety for all Red Cross volunteers and the members of the community that receive our services. The purpose of verifying an ID is to ensure the name on the ID matches the name submitted on the background check authorization form. Adult prospective volunteers on a responsive entry path must submit an acceptable form of identification, which will be verified by advanced trained VIPC team members. The American Red Cross requires volunteers to provide proof of ID and conduct a background check because the Red Cross is a trusted brand. We provide services to people at their most vulnerable time. Volunteers and employees can be exposed to very personal information and situations. As a safety measure for our clients and staff, all paid and unpaid adult Red Crossers must successfully clear a background check. The addition of the ID verification process ensures the most thorough background check results. The background check authorization form will prompt an adult prospective volunteer to submit their legal name. In the background check section, we see the legal name the applicant has submitted on the background check authorization form. Make note of the legal name displayed in the background check section. Review the common scenarios to determine how to proceed. On the left side of the account detail page in the background check section, you see the legal name field. The name listed is what the prospective volunteer has submitted on their background check authorization form when prompted to enter their legal name. If the name on the ID matches the name submitted in the legal name field, you may verify the ID and continue to process the background check unless the applicant is from one of the exception regions. You will see a list of these exception regions later in the presentation. You may come across some scenarios that require some additional analysis before determining how to proceed. Extended family names or hyphenated names may be one common scenario. If the ID has multiple family names or a hyphenated name, if the first name and one of the last names on the ID matches the background check authorization name, you may proceed with authorization. If a prospective volunteer has a suffix added to the legal name field, you will need to edit the legal name field before proceeding. That process will be reviewed in upcoming slides. If the prospective volunteer has a suffix on the ID but not in the legal name field, you may verify the ID and process the background check. If the legal name field does not match the name on the ID, there are three different options to determine how you will proceed. First, you will need to call the prospective volunteer to determine their legal name. If you speak to the prospective volunteer and determine that the ID has their legal name, inform them that they will need to reauthorize the background check with their legal name. You will edit the legal name field with the correct legal name, open Manage Background Check, cancel the current background check, create a new +1 background check, and then refresh the account detail page. Let's walk through those steps. So to edit the legal name, you'll click on the link next to the legal name. A pop-up window will appear where you can make and save the edits. Then right-click on Manage Background Check to open in a new tab. Over towards the right, click Cancel Current Background Check. You will be prompted to confirm that you do want to cancel the current background check. Next, you will click New Background Check to create a new background check for the applicant. You will need to select the New Volunteer Screening +1 package and then submit twice. Go ahead and click the Submit button, and then you'll refresh the account detail page. You should see the new background check. You want to set the contact complete status to VIPC ID BGC resubmit pending, and then send the VIPC ID BGC resubmit follow-up email. Another option for this common scenario when the ID and the legal name field do not match, if you call the prospective volunteer and they tell you that the legal name field is their legal name and that the ID is not accurate, you will need to click the Resubmit button by the ID. This will eliminate what has been submitted and will allow the prospective volunteer to resubmit a new ID. Send the VIPC ID resubmit request email. Update the contact complete status to VIPC ID BGC resubmit pending. When you hit the resubmit button, the system will automatically uncheck the photo ID upload completed after setting the status to ID resubmit. The next common scenario, same situation where you have a legal name field that does not match the ID. Call the applicant, and this time we're not able to speak to the applicant, so we will need to leave a message. So here on the screen you see the script for the voicemail. You'll thank them for choosing the Red Cross for volunteering, and then you will explain that the ID does not match the name in the legal name field. You will explain that if the name on the background check authorization form is their legal name, they'll be asked to resubmit a new ID. And if the ID is the legal name, they will be asked to reauthorize a new background check. As always, please include the helpline number so they can follow up if they have additional questions. Make an internal note that you left a voicemail and that we need clarification. Send the VIPC ID clarification needed email and update the contact complete status to VIPC ID needs clarification. Once an application is in an ID clarification status, we will need to follow up. If the VIPC ID clarification email was sent 6 days prior and has not been resent already, resend the VIPC ID clarification email if the volunteer has not responded with clarifying information. You want to refresh the VIPC ID needs clarification contact complete status. If the VIPC ID clarification email was resent and it has been 6 days since the prospective volunteer has received the second email, then you may go ahead and deactivate the account. Some additional notes regarding IDs. You do not need to concern yourself with the middle name or middle initial. We do not look at expiration dates, and there is no need to match the address on the profile with the address on the ID. Here are the accepted approved forms for IDs for primary forms of identification. Much like the DMV, this is a list of acceptable forms of identification. Applicants must choose to upload one ID from the list of primary forms of ID, or they can choose to upload 2 IDs from the list of secondary forms ID listed on the next slide. This list is also available in the VIPC group share under the Files section. Note, a military ID would fall under the federal ID category. Many of these IDs are standard and will be recognizable when you see them, as they will have a title such as driver's license. But if you have any doubt, contact your intake leader or program manager. If you talk to a prospective volunteer that does not want to scan or upload a picture of their ID to the application site, they do have some options. They can contact a local office to show their ID in person, and they may go to a notary to have their ID verified through a notary. Applicants can also send a copy of their ID to the VIPC mailbox. Here is a list of the secondary forms of ID. Applicants must submit 2 forms of secondary form ID. It is important to note that if they submit 2 forms of ID, if one of the IDs does not meet the criteria, you must cancel both of them so that it allows the prospective volunteer to see the link to resubmit acceptable forms of ID. So here's a checklist for the photo ID verification. You're going to filter for ID needs, going to note the name in the legal name field, go to the background check section and make sure we're at a ready status. If the background check is anything other than ready, do not verify the ID. View the ID document and verify that it is an acceptable form of ID. Note, you will not have access to the documents once they have been verified. IDs that have been in the system for more than 30 days will automatically be purged from the system, and the system should not allow a volunteer to enter the same document twice when submitting 2 forms of secondary ID. So note that the background check section is at a ready status before you view the ID. Open the ID. It may take several long seconds before you view the ID. Look at the name and compare to the legal name in the legal name field in the background check section. Select the qualification name and confirm. So you may have a situation where you have some scenarios where the ID is not an acceptable form, or you may not be able to read it. So if the ID is illegible, not an approved form of identification, or only contains one form of secondary ID, you need to delete the ID and log internal notes for noting the reason that the ID was not acceptable. Call the prospective volunteer using the VIPC ID BGC resubmit phone script. Send the VIPC ID resubmit request email. Update the contact complete status to VIPC ID BGC resubmit pending. The system will automatically uncheck the photo ID upload completed after setting the status to ID resubmit. So note that once you've refreshed the page, the photo ID upload completed should be unchecked. On the screen, we see the ID resubmit phone script. Identify yourself as a volunteer with the Red Cross and thank them for volunteering with us. Explain specifically why the ID was not acceptable and give them information about how to proceed. And as always, please make sure that you include the information about our helpline number. So when the volunteer logs back into the system, they will see on the thank you page a link that will give them information about how to upload a new ID. So after you've verified the ID, we will process the background check unless the applicant is from one of our exception regions. So here we have a list of those exception regions. We have 3 regions in New York. We also have Michigan region, Kentucky region, and the New England region, which includes the states of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Internal notes are key communication for our team. We are a very large team, and it's important to make note of any internal notes that will help the next person know how to manage this account. So please take time to log internal notes about how you managed the account. Thank you for joining us today to review the ID verification process. If you have any questions, please contact your intake leader or program manager.